Can you imagine your own parents looking you in the eye and telling you that your life isn't worth saving? That's what happened to me. They didn't want me to die, not exactly, but they made a choice that meant I would. Also, my sister could go to college. From the moment I can remember, my sister, Delaney, was the son my parents revolved around. When she was 7 and got into a competitive dance company, they rented out a banquet hall, 40 relatives, a chocolate fountain, a hired photographer. It was a production. That same spring, I won the citywide art competition. Not a small thing, right? But nobody came to the ceremony. I carried my framed painting home on 2 buses, alone in the cold, because there was no one to call for a ride. That one afternoon, the sheer emptiness of it, pretty much set the tone for my entire childhood. Delaney was the baby they prayed for, the one they spent 6 years and 3 miscarriages trying to have. I came 2 years later unplanned. The kid who just showed up after they already had their perfect child. She got a nursery with dancers painted across the wall, a rocking chair that probably cost more than our car. Me? I got a mattress on a metal frame and blankets that used to be hers. My mom kept every single one of Delaney's recital programs. Every costume, every worn-out pair of ballet shoes, all neatly labeled in bins in the attic. My drawings, the ones I poured my soul into, straight into the recycling bin. By the time I was 9, I'd stopped expecting anyone to show up for anything that concerned me. I packed my own lunches, washed my own clothes, walked myself to school. Delaney, though, she got driven, even when we were headed to the same building. I'd stand there, watching the car pull out of the driveway, knowing I had a half-hour walk ahead with a backpack full of supplies I'd bought with my own babysitting money. Teachers would tell me how mature I was. The truth was, I just never had a choice. The part that truly wore me down, that gnawed at my spirit, was the way they lied about it. To my face. "We love you both the same," Mom would say, sitting front row at another one of Delaney's showcases, knowing full well she hadn't come to a single one of my art shows all year. Or Dad, scrolling through endless photos of Delaney on his phone to show his coworkers. Not a single picture of me in the entire roll. "You are making things up," he'd tell me. They had this shelf in the living room, a literal monument to Delaney, trophies, medals, framed photos from every age. Me, one faded school picture stuck to the fridge with a magnet, not swapped out since 3rd grade. It was like I was invisible, a ghost in my own home. When I was 16, something incredible happened. I got into a pre-college summer intensive at a real art school, a competitive program that only took a few dozen kids from across the country. It was 4 hours away, the kind of opportunity that could change the direction of my whole life. I ran home, clutching that acceptance letter, absolutely sure that this time it was too big for them to ignore. Mom skimmed it, her eyes barely registering the words. "That's nice," she said, her tone flat. "But Delaney has a regional competition that weekend, so there's no one to drive you." Just like that. She wouldn't miss one dance meet to give me the one shot I'd ever been handed. So I got a job and started putting away every dollar for college, because I already knew they would never spend a cent on mine. Delaney, of course, had a college fund, something Mom brought up in every conversation. "We have $38,000 saved for Delaney," she beamed to relatives at holidays. When those same relatives asked what my plan was, she'd just wave a hand and say, "Oh, she's the resourceful one, she'll figure it out." Like being able to survive on nothing was a prize she'd given me, instead of a thing she'd forced on me. It felt like a curse. Then, the winter I was 17, my body started betraying me. Bruises appeared out of nowhere, a tiredness so heavy I could barely lift my arms after a shift. I ignored it for weeks because in that house, being sick just meant being a burden. I didn't want to bother anyone. Then I collapsed at work and woke up in a hospital bed. The test came back acute leukemia. It was far enough along that the doctors couldn't understand how I'd been standing at all. And for the first time in my whole life, my parents looked at me like I was something worth looking at. Mom cried real tears. She held my hand through the first rounds of chemo, sleeping sitting up in the vinyl chair by my bed. Dad took days off work, something he had never once done for anything of mine, but he did it now that I might be dying. They brought balloons, stuffed animals, cards, every soft thing I'd wanted as a small kid and never gotten. For 3 months, I had the parents I had spent 17 years waiting for. And the treatment worked. My counts climbed back. The doctor said if we finished the full course, I had a real shot. I let myself believe that almost losing me had finally shown them I was worth keeping. Mom told me she was proud of how strong I was. And I cried, because those were words I had wanted my entire life. Then Delaney got into Juilliard. Not on a scholarship, not on aid. It was just her dream. And Mom said they would find a way to make it happen no matter what. The very next afternoon, Mom sat down on the edge of my hospital bed. She had this careful, sorry look I had learned not to trust years ago. "Honey, we need to talk about the cost of your treatment," she said. My stomach dropped. She started in about how insurance only covered so much. And with Delaney's tuition coming up, they had to make hard choices. I sat there numb while she explained that after this round, they were going to stop paying for my chemo. She told me Delaney's education was a real investment in a future, while my treatment was just delaying something that was going to happen anyway. She actually said I had already had a good life, hadn't I? And that I shouldn't be selfish about my sister's chance. Selfish. She actually used the word selfish about me not wanting to die of cancer so that her favorite could go to a dance school. "We'll keep you comfortable," she said, like she was offering me a gift. "But Juilliard only takes you once. Your cancer will probably just come back anyway." She said it flat, like she had already filed me under gone. Delaney needed the money for tuition, a dorm, pointy shoes, studio fees. I needed it to not die, but I had never once been the thing that mattered in that house. I looked at the woman who had held my hand through chemo just long enough to feel like she had done her part. And now that Delaney needed something, I was disposable again. Worse than forgotten. I was being actively handed over. She was choosing my sister's college years over whether I got to have any years at all. And she wanted me to nod along like it made sense, but I wasn't going to lie there and let it happen. The second Mom left the room, I grabbed my phone, my hand shaking so hard I could barely get it unlocked. The chemo line hummed next to me while I typed "medical emancipation for minors" into the search bar. And I started reading everything I could find. There were cases, real ones, of teenagers who had gone to court over their own medical care when their parents refused it. I saved screenshot after screenshot, legal definitions, patient rights, stories of kids who had actually won. My eyes burned from the bright screen in the dark room, but I kept scrolling, saving articles about minors getting the right to make their own medical decisions. The IV tugged at the back of my hand every time I shifted, but I didn't care. Every page gave me a little more of something I hadn't felt in weeks. The idea that maybe I didn't just have to lie down and die, because my parents had decided a dorm room mattered more than my life. By the time the sky started going gray outside the window, I had 24 screenshots and a rough understanding of what medical neglect actually meant in the eyes of the law. My phone was at 6%, and my eyes felt like sandpaper. But for the first time, I had something that looked like a plan. Dr. Alvarez came in for morning rounds a little after 7. He took one look at my face and stopped in the doorway. He asked carefully if things were all right at home, in a voice that told me he already suspected they were not. I tried to hold it in, but instead it all came pouring out. I told him what Mom had said about cutting off my treatment after this round, about Delaney and Juilliard, about how she had told me my cancer would probably come back. So why bother spending the money? His face changed from concern to something harder. His jaw tightened, and he set his tablet down on the counter with more force than he needed to. He asked me to repeat exactly what she had said, word for word, and I did. I watched him get angrier with every sentence. When I finished, he pulled out his phone and started typing fast, his whole body tense. He told me he was paging the hospital social worker right then and that I was not being discharged until we had gone through every single option for keeping my treatment going. He sat down in the chair by my bed and laid it out plainly. The cancer was responding well. My counts were climbing. Everything pointed toward remission if we finished the protocol. But stopping now halfway through would be, in his words, medically catastrophic. The leukemia would almost certainly return within months, likely more aggressive, and my odds of surviving would collapse to almost nothing. He kept repeating that this was not a case of prolonging the inevitable, the way my mother had framed it. This was stopping a treatment that was working and handing me a death that I did not have to have. The flat, factual anger in his voice made it more real than any of Mom's soft, sorry faces ever had. Diane Kessler showed up less than an hour later, a woman somewhere in her 50s with tired eyes and a way of moving like nothing could rush her. She had a legal pad under one arm, introduced herself as the hospital social worker, and pulled a chair right up to the side of my bed, like she had nowhere else in the world to be. She told me she had handled cases like mine before, and something in how she said it made me believe her. She asked me to start at the beginning and walk her through the whole thing, everything that had led to this. And for the first time in my life, an adult just listened. No interrupting, no excuses, just writing things down and nodding while I talked. She had a way of looking at me that made it clear she believed every word, that she wasn't going to file this under family drama and move on. When I paused, she asked precise questions about dates, about patterns, about how far back it went. I told her all of it, and the words came easier than I expected. The 40-guest party for Delaney making the dance company against my art award that I carried home on the bus alone because no one came. Delaney's nursery with the painted dancers against my mattress on a metal frame. The summer art program I never got to attend because Mom wouldn't miss one dance meet to drag me 4 hours. The $38,000 fund she bragged about while telling relatives I would figure my own way out. Diane wrote it all down without changing her expression. Just asked how old I was when each thing happened, how often they missed my things, whether anyone else had ever seen the way they treated us differently. She asked about the 3 months when they had actually shown up during chemo, and then what had changed. I told her about the Juilliard letter and about Mom sitting on my bed the very next day to tell me they were done paying to keep me alive. Diane sat down her pen and explained that parents legally control medical decisions for a minor, which I already knew from my night of reading. But then she said there were emergency provisions in the law for situations where a guardian's choice actively puts a child's life in danger. She used the term medical neglect. My stomach turned over because it meant officially saying my parents were harming me. It meant turning this into a legal thing instead of just a family falling apart. She sound her eye face and told me that medical neglect is not about what a parent intends. It is about what happens. If a parent denies a child necessary life-saving treatment, that is neglect. No matter the reason behind it, the courts take it seriously, she said, because it involves a minor who cannot fight for themselves. Except I am fighting for myself right now, I told her. And she said, then let's do it properly. She pulled out her phone and started a list of what she needed. My full medical records from diagnosis to now, the complete treatment plan showing what came next, and Dr. Bold Alvarez's written medical opinion about what would happen if the chemo stopped. She said she also needed to bring in the hospital ethics committee because this was a life-and-death decision being made against a patient's wishes. And the committee could review whether my parents' choice counted as neglect and make a recommendation to family court. All of it would move fast, she said. Days, not weeks, because the timing mattered. Every day we waited was a day closer to the next scheduled chemo cycle, and we needed legal clarity before that appointment. She asked if I was certain, because once we started, it would get ugly and my parents would know I had gone to the hospital staff. I told her I was certain because the other option was dying, and I had spent 17 years being the kid nobody fought for. So I might as well be the one to fight. I texted Delaney and asked her to come see me alone without our parents because I needed to know where she actually stood. I stared at the message before I sent it, not sure what I wanted her to say. Part of me hoped she would be horrified, that she would offer to take out loans or push her start date. Another part expected her to fold the way she always did and explain why her future mattered more than mine. The message sat on, delivered, for hours. I made myself put the phone down. Finally, it buzzed, and she said she would come after her evening rehearsal around 800. The message was short and gave nothing away, but at least she was coming. Dr. Alvarez came back in the late afternoon with a folder and a grim look and handed it to Diane. It was several pages of medical documentation on hospital letterhead. My whole prognosis, written out in the kind of careful language meant for a courtroom, not a bedside. Finishing treatment gave me a 75% 5-year survival rate, meaning 3 out of 4 patients like me would still be alive in 5 years if we completed the protocol. Stopping now dropped that below 15% within 2 years. Seeing the numbers written out in black ink made everything land differently. It wasn't just a doctor saying treatment mattered. It was math proving that my parents were choosing to move me from the 75% group into the 15% group. Diane read it carefully, highlighting sections in yellow, then looked at me and said, "This is exactly what we needed. No judge could look at those numbers and call what your parents are doing a reasonable medical decision." Someone from billing came by right before dinner, a nervous guy with a tablet who said he needed to review my account. He pulled up screens of codes that meant nothing to me until he started turning them into dollars. My treatment so far had run past $44,000, which broke my brain a little because I couldn't picture that much money being spent on me. Insurance had covered most of it, leaving my parents responsible for around $11,000 in co-pays and deductibles. The rest of the cycles I needed would come to about $27,000 more, with insurance likely covering the bulk and leaving roughly $9,000 in out-of-pocket costs. So, my parents were choosing not to spend $9,000. And that choice would kill me. $9,000, almost exactly what Delaney's first semester deposit and dorm costs came to. The billing guy kept talking about payment plans and financial aid programs, but all I could hear was that Mom's decision suddenly made a cold financial sense, even while it was the most disgusting thing I had ever heard. She wasn't choosing between $44,000 and my life. She was choosing between $9,000 and my life. And she had decided $9,000 was too much to spend on the kid she never wanted in the first place. I sat with those numbers for hours, trying to understand how my whole existence had been reduced to a math problem my parents had solved by crossing me out. Delaney showed up at 8:12, looking like she hadn't slept in days. She still had her hair pinned back from rehearsal, and there were dark rings under her eyes that made her look older than 19. She sat in the chair by my bed without a word at first, staring at her hands, then blurted out that she had told Mom she would take out student loans, that they didn't have to touch anything if it meant stopping my treatment. Something loosened in my chest for a second before she kept going. Mom had refused completely, said the loans would wreck Delaney's credit and her future, that I was being dramatic, that the treatment probably wouldn't work in the long run anyway, so why throw money away that could give Delaney a real shot? Delaney's voice cracked, repeating it, and her hands were shaking. I asked her straight out whether she thought her school was worth more than my life, and the question hung in the air between us like something solid. She started to cry, actual tears, saying she didn't know what to do anymore, that Mom had controlled every choice she'd ever made. Her classes, her schedule, her friends, who she was allowed to be. She said she was terrified of disappointing them, but she knew what they were doing to me was wrong, and being caught in the middle was tearing her apart. Part of me wanted to feel bad for her, but mostly I just felt tired, because even now she was making it about her own feelings instead of whether I lived. She wiped her face and started telling me things I hadn't known. Dad's business had been bleeding money for 2 years, losing accounts to bigger firms, barely covering its own costs. They were buried in credit card debt and a second mortgage. The college fund wasn't really $38,000 anymore, more like $30,000 after they had pulled from it for emergency repairs and Dad's own medical bills from a scare last year. It clicked into place why they were panicking about money. But it didn't change the fact that they had decided to let me die instead of finding another way. Delaney kept explaining, like the debt made it reasonable, like being broke gave them the right to trade one kid for the other. I told her plenty of families have money problems and don't decide to kill one of their children over it. And she flinched, like I had hit her. We sat in a hard silence until Diane knocked on the doorframe and came back in with a folder, reading the tension in the room instantly. She asked Delaney if she would be willing to write a statement about the pattern of favoritism and neglect she had watched growing up. Delaney hesitated, and I could see her wrestling with the idea of putting it in writing, something that could be used against our parents in a court. Then she nodded and said she would write down everything she had seen since we were kids, every time they had picked her over me or acted like I didn't exist. Diane handed her paper and a pen and told her to be as specific with dates and events as she could. After Delaney left with the pages under her arm, Diane sat down and we talked through what came next. She had been on the phone all afternoon, lining up the legal steps. The hospital was behind me completely, which meant I had support that most kids in my position would never get. That night, after Diane left and the nurses finished their evening rounds, I lay staring at the ceiling, trying to think about nothing. Around 900, the phone on the tray table started ringing, and I knew without looking it was Mom. I let it go to voicemail and then played it back because I was too worn out to stop it. She said I was being selfish and manipulative, that I was trying to burn down Delaney's future out of jealousy because I had always resented her for being the favorite. She said I needed to face reality and stop making the family look bad. The dragging in social workers was just me being spiteful. Her voice was sharp and furious, but underneath it there was something that might have been fear, like she knew what she had done and couldn't say it out loud. I deleted the message and turned the ringer off so she couldn't reach me again. Sleep didn't come for a long time, and when it did, I dreamed about being underwater while people stood on the shore and watched. Morning came in weak and gray. Nurses checking my vitals, a tray of food I couldn't touch. Diane arrived around 8 with coffee and a man in his 30s in a decent plain suit. She introduced him as Elias Fontaine, a legal aid attorney who worked cases about kids and medical rights. He shook my hand, sat down with the folder Diane had built, and read through all of it slowly, making notes on a yellow pad. After 20 minutes, he looked up and told me we had grounds for an emergency case. My heart started going fast because it was really happening. We were actually going to fight my parents in court over whether I got to live. Elias laid out the process in plain terms, without talking down to me. First, we would file for temporary authority over my medical decisions to be moved from my parents to the hospital, just for now. Then, we would push for limited medical emancipation until I turned 18 in 7 months, which wasn't full adult rights, but would let me say yes to my own treatment. He said it would move fast, because when a kid's survival is on the line, judges take it seriously. The hospital ethics committee scheduled an emergency meeting for the next day, faster than I had thought possible. That afternoon, a woman named Grace Whitfield from the ethics committee came to talk to me alone. No Diane, no Elias, no doctors. She was maybe 50, gray hair, a steady kind of face. And she asked me careful questions about whether I understood what the treatment involved and what would happen if I stopped. She wanted to know if the doctors were pressuring me to keep going or if this was truly my own choice. And I could tell she was trying to figure out whether I was mature enough to make it. I told her I'd been making my own choices since I was 9, deciding what I ate and when I slept and how I got to school. Because my parents had checked out of raising me a long time ago. The only difference now was that this choice was about whether I lived instead of whether I had clean clothes. Grace wrote it all down and asked more about my parents, about Delaney, about how I had handled being sick. Then she asked what I wanted my future to look like, and I realized, with a strange jolt, that I hadn't let myself think past the next month. Surviving had felt so far off that planning anything beyond it seemed pointless. I told her I wanted to finish high school and maybe go to art school after all, get a job I didn't hate, and just exist without having to fight for scraps of care from people who were supposed to love me. It sounded so small out loud, the bare minimum of a life, but it was more than I had ever let myself hope for. That same afternoon, my parents showed up without warning, and I heard them before I saw them because their voices carried down the hall. They had brought a lawyer, an older man in a gray suit, already talking about parental rights and family privacy before he reached my door. Diane must have been watching for them because she stepped out and intercepted them right outside my room, and suddenly there were 3 adults arguing in voices that kept climbing. I sat frozen in the bed listening to Mom call me difficult and the lawyer insist they had every right to decide their minor child's care. Diane's voice stayed level but hard, saying the hospital had serious concerns about medical neglect and that an ethics review was already underway. The lawyer threw around words like lawsuit and overreach. And then their voices moved off down the hall until I couldn't make out the words, just the angry shape of them, and my chest went tight. Rosa, the nurse who had been taking care of me most of that week, came in about 20 minutes later to check my line. She adjusted the IV without saying anything at first, then glanced at the closed door and spoke quietly. She told me she had seen this before. Parents who couldn't carry the money or the fear or the plain exhaustion of a seriously sick kid, who talked themselves into believing that giving up was a kind of mercy, that they were sparing their child from suffering when really they were sparing themselves from having to keep going. She looked right at me and said, "It was not my job to make their choice easier by dying when it was convenient for them." It hit hard because nobody had put it that plainly, that my parents wanted the easy way out and expected me to cooperate. Rosa finished with my line and left without another word, but I kept turning it over for hours. The next afternoon, Bianca showed up, a coworker from the diner carrying a big canvas bag. And when she dumped it out on my bed, there was a phone charger, my favorite snacks, a stack of magazines, and a card so covered in signatures there was barely white space left. She said everyone from the diner had signed it, and they had passed a jar around and raised $300 toward my treatment. It was almost nothing against what I needed, but I started crying anyway because people who had only known me a few months, who just worked shifts next to me, cared more about keeping me alive than my own parents did. Bianca hugged me while I cried and told me the whole crew was pulling for me, that they had been following it and wanted to help however they could. She stayed 2 hours just talking about normal things, work gossip, and which manager was the worst, giving me a break from thinking about court and cancer and parents who wanted me gone. Elias came back the next day to prep me for the hearing. He pulled out his yellow pad and started running me through practice questions, teaching me how to stay calm and factual, even when the other lawyer tried to rattle me or twist my words. He said judges saw through manipulation all the time and that my story staying consistent across every witness would be my strongest evidence. We ran it for over an hour, him asking harder and harder questions about my parents, me learning to answer without going defensive or breaking down. By the end, I felt a little more ready and still completely terrified. That night, I couldn't sleep. Around 2:06 between when I opened the notes app and started writing everything down. What it was like to be the kid nobody wanted. Walking to school while Delaney got driven, buying my own supplies with babysitting money. The painting I carried home on 2 buses in the cold. The art program I never got to attend. Packing my own lunches from 4th grade on. The shelf that was a shrine to Delaney and my one outdated photo on the fridge. Every forgotten birthday and skipped art show. Every time they picked her recital over anything I needed, the words came fast. Not even angry, just factual. Like I was logging evidence of a thing that had always been true and no one had ever admitted. By the time the light came up, I had 5 single-spaced pages, 17 years of being second, organized into clear examples that proved a pattern. Diane had said we needed documentation, and this was what I had. The ethics committee met and voted unanimously to support the emergency petition. Diane told me that the evidence of neglect and endangerment was clear enough that they were comfortable backing the legal action. Grace had personally called the family court judge to get the hearing expedited because this was life and death timing, and the judge had agreed to schedule it within days. The morning of the hearing, Elias filed the counter to my parents' overnight motion, which I read and could barely see straight afterward. Their lawyer claimed I had been manipulated by hospital staff who wanted to run up the bill that the doctors were using me to make money, and that my parents were simply making a reasonable choice based on real financial limits. The idea that Dr. Tarmio, Alvarez, and Diane were using me landed like a slap, because those two had fought harder for my life than my own parents ever had. Elias barely reacted when I showed it to him, just said, "Desperate people make desperate arguments," and went back to prep. 3 days after Mom's announcement, I put on the nicest clothes I owned, which wasn't saying much, and Elias drove me to the courthouse, an old brick building downtown that smelled like floor polish and nerves. The hearing room was smaller than I had pictured, a plain office with a desk for the judge and a few rows of chairs. I sat next to Elias on one side, while my parents and their lawyer sat across the aisle, close enough that I could see Mom's face, though she wouldn't look at me once. Dad stared at his hands. Delaney wasn't there because Diane had said it was better she stay out unless they needed her to testify. The judge came in, we stood and sat, and it began. Dr. Term, Alvarez testified first, walking up with a thick folder of my records. He explained it all in clear, simple terms, that my leukemia was responding well, but that stopping now would be a death sentence within months. He showed charts of my counts climbing and laid out exactly what the remaining cycles would do, and stated plainly that finishing the protocol gave me excellent odds of long-term survival. When my parents' lawyer tried to suggest the cancer might come back anyway, Dr. Alvarez shut it down fast, saying that was true of any cancer patient and was not a reason to stop treating someone whose disease was actively responding. Diane took the stand next and opened the folder she'd built over the week. She walked through her interviews with me, with Delaney, with the nurses who had watched my parents vanish the moment Juilliard entered the picture. She read from Delaney's 3-page statement about every event they skipped, every time they chose her over me since we were kids. Then she laid out my own 5 pages, 17 years of being the accident they never wanted, and you could see people in the room shift in their seats. She laid the pattern out so clearly that even my parents' lawyer looked uncomfortable. A whole history of neglect that existed long before cancer made it a matter of life and death. The pages covered the table in front of the judge. Proof. I had been raising myself since I was 9. While they poured everything into Delaney, my parents' lawyer stood and argued they had been present through my treatment, that Mom had slept in the chairs and Dad had taken time off. Pointing to the 3 months of chemo visits like that erased 17 years of nothing. Then Elias stood for his turn and asked one question that cut through all of it. He asked why that care had stopped the exact moment Delaney's college plans needed money. Why my life had been worth their attention only until it competed with their favorite's dream. The lawyer had no real answer, just kept repeating that they had been there when it mattered. And Elias made it plain that if it had really mattered, I would not be in a courtroom fighting for my treatment right now. Then the judge looked at me and said she needed to hear from me, and my legs felt unsteady. Walking to the front, she asked me directly what I wanted, and my voice came out smaller than I meant it to. I said I wanted to live, that I wanted to finish the treatment that was working, that my cancer was getting better and stopping now would kill me within months. I told her I understood my parents could not or would not pay, but that it should not mean I had to die, that there had to be other options besides giving up on me. I kept my eyes on the judge because looking at my parents felt impossible, and I could feel tears building. But I forced them back because I needed to sound strong enough to be worth saving. The judge turned to my parents and asked if they had looked into payment plans, charity care, Medicaid, fundraising, anything at all besides simply stopping treatment. Dad admitted they had not because they thought an insurance denial meant no other options existed. The judge's face made it very clear what she thought of that. She asked why they had not gone to the hospital's financial counselors, why their first response to a money problem was letting their child die. Dad had nothing. Mom stared at her hands while the silence stretched out. Then Mom spoke up, her voice shaking, trying to say she was protecting me from false hope, making my last months comfortable instead of full of painful treatment. Even she didn't sound like she believed it. The words coming out wrong, like a script she had memorized but never understood. The judge leaned forward and asked her straight out whether she was choosing one child's education over the other child's life. Mom opened her mouth and nothing came out. And that silence answered louder than anything she could have said. You could watch her searching for some way to make it sound reasonable. Some version where trading one kid for the other was good parenting. And there was not one, and everyone in that room knew it. The judge did not leave to think about it. She granted temporary emergency authority to the hospital to continue my treatment while the full emancipation petition moved through the system. She ordered my parents to cooperate with Medicaid applications and charity care reviews, and to provide whatever financial documentation the hospital needed. It meant I could keep getting chemo no matter what they wanted, that their decision to let me die did not matter anymore because the court had just taken that choice out of their hands. I felt Elias press a hand to my shoulder and realized I had stopped breathing. And then a wave of relief hit me so hard the room tilted. And for the first time since Mom sat on the edge of my bed and told me I was not worth $9,000, I knew I was going to live. This is my story. It's still hard to believe it all happened. What would you have done in my place? Have any of you ever faced a decision this impossible with your family? Tell me what you think in the comments below. I really want to know.